Yeah, my name is Vic Copan. I lived for 16 years in Vienna, Austria, and I was working with the Austrian Protestant Church there, and worked a lot with theology students at the University of Vienna. And in the course of that, I was doing some doctoral work, and the topic that I chose was looking at the Apostle Paul as a spiritual director, looking primarily at his imitation passages where he encouraged people to imitate him. And that got me to the heart of spiritual formation without me even realizing it. But fruitful time. And after 16 years, I received a call to be a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University, associate professor, and I've been teaching there for the last 13 years, primarily in the area of biblical studies and ministry studies, and for the last, for each semester since I started, I've been teaching on spiritual formation. And because of all the things that I was learning in teaching on spiritual formation and writing in that area, I thought I would gather a lot of the ideas that I'd been working on into a book, and just recently published with Cascade Publishers. And the title is called Changing Your Mind, the Bible, the Brain, and Spiritual Growth. There's a lot of fuzziness about spirituality and spiritual formation that's out there, and you can get all different kinds of spirituality. Now you look on you look at Amazon, and the offerings of books go into the thousands of all different kinds of spiritualities. But as a result of my doctoral work, focusing in on Paul, I began asking, what's Christian spirituality? What's the heart of it? And for me, in my research on looking at the Apostle Paul as a spiritual director, and looking at what his aims were as he directed the various congregations, the churches that he started, it became crystal clear to me that he has a razor-sharp focus on Christ himself. And it's such a Christocentric vision that he had that is embedded in the creation story, that, and I think Paul thinks in cosmic terms, if you will, and his way of thinking and his reasoning is asking the question, what is God doing in the world? And so it starts with creation, and the focus there on humanity is being created in the image of God. And Paul then takes that idea, and through the fall, he says that needs to be restored. Paul picks up the creation theme of the image of God in Romans 8, and he says he desires all people to be conformed to the image of his Son. And that, to me, is the absolute heart of spirituality, of spiritual formation as understood by Christians. So spiritual formation is not about ecstatic experiences. It's not about getting into deeper and deeper levels of prayer. They're important, but that's not the main focus. The main focus is having the entire life become conformed to the image of Christ on an ever-increasing level. Again, going back to my research for my doctoral studies, thinking about Paul's vision, Paul's aim for his congregations, my own research fell into when I began reading Dallas Willard's books, particularly his book Renovation of the Heart. Where Dallas Willard was going was where I was going, in my own thinking. And I love his definition of spiritual formation. I've tweaked it a little bit, and I'll try to recreate it here. Christian spiritual formation is the redemptive process of intentionally shaping and forming our interior and exterior life so that it more and more takes on the character and the inner being of Christ himself. That to me is a fantastic summary of what I think Paul is doing in his writings, and I think it's the vision of the New Testament there, which means it needs to incorporate all of who we are. We need to think about how are we, who Jesus is for one, and how do we become more like him in all those dimensions. You hear about the new findings in neuroscience about how the brain works and how the brain and body function together, and began hearing about the plasticity of the brain, the ability of the brain to reshape itself through the things that we do. And I began thinking about how that whole area of research would interface with what in the Christian world we talk about spiritual formation. How do they interface with one another? Do they connect? Do they not? Are they separate things, or are they not? And so in writing this book, I wanted to immerse myself into this question of how do these two things interface. And my studies have led me to the conclusion that it's an artificial distinction to say, on the one hand, there's personal growth, human growth, psychological growth, and on the other hand, on the other side, separated from that, is spiritual growth. I think God made us as an entire being, unified, so you can't separate spiritual growth or personal growth on the one hand and spiritual growth on the other. They blend together into one. And I think my goal is to discover what neuroscience has uncovered about how we function as human beings, how we grow and develop, and to say, how can we use what we're learning here in service of growing spiritually with our aim of becoming more and more like Christ? And it was just a wonderful, fascinating area of research in all the facets of who we are and how we change in all of our dimensions. I began seeing that spiritual formation is less Gnostic, you could call it, and more earthy, that it incorporates all of who we are, our body, our mind, our thoughts, our emotions, and our relationships, primarily through a more careful study of the creation story, Genesis 1 and 2, and how it's described how we are created. And the imagery that is used in the creation story is that God is pictured as someone who is like a potter creating something. That the Hebrew terminology there is of a craftsman who's taking physical material, dirt in this case, and fashioning it in a way that creates something both beautiful and purposeful. And when you look at the elements that we are created out of, the dirt, the physicality of that, you can study those elements, you can analyze those things that make us up, that and we can begin discovering what things there are that leads to human flourishing, and what things there are that cause damage to us as our entire being. And another thing that I discovered is the use of the language of the soul, particularly in the Genesis account. It says God created us as a living nephesh, a living soul. So the language itself indicates we don't have a soul, we are a soul. And that when God comes in to dwell in us, he dwells in every aspect and every cell of who we are. And so we can, when we think about spiritual formation, we have to ask, how does God embody, indwell our thoughts, our emotions, the things that we do with our bodies, and the things that we do in our relationships with other bodies, with other souls. And so it was just a careful study of and taking seriously the language of the creation account that moved me away from more simply Gnostic understandings of just simply thinking different things to a full embodiment of what it means to be in the image of God. How do people change? What's the process? I think those are really important topics to think carefully through. And as a result of teaching my classes for the last 13 years in spiritual formation, my aim has always been not to pass on theory. It's always been thinking about how can I help these students change in those areas that they sense they need to change in. And so it's always been a very practical focus and a practical aim how to do that. And what I've tried to do in the book is lay out all the factors that I think are important on spiritual growth, spiritual formation, spiritual development. There are various components that when you analyze them, as people have grown spiritually, you can analyze all those elements together. And what you need is you need to put these together, synthesize them into a workable plan. And so I've tried to lay that out in the book, but in my classes what I've done is I've given them a task in the semester, early in the semester, for each student to identify one area that they sense they need to grow in. And then I have them think through what are the things that what are the practices that they can engage in on a consistent, regular basis that they think might lead them in that direction. And I embed that into a whole process. I make sure that each one has an accountability partner that they're meeting with regularly. They're embedded in a small group that talks about that. But this intentional focus, in reading the weekly reflections of what they were practicing and how they were going about it, in reading the reflections, I've noticed there's this incremental change that takes place in the students that they themselves, because they're reflecting on it and engaging in it, they can see incremental change on a regular basis, so that by the end of the semester, when they look back and look at this whole project, they themselves are surprised at how much has happened in the meantime. And I think particularly you can see that for a lot of people, it's one area where they've seen a lot of growth. But I also have had a number of students where it's been dramatic, where they have struggled with an area, say, fear of others that goes way back to the childhood, that they've never confronted before. And through this process, they have moved in a direction of real health and healing as a result of taking this embodiment, this practice seriously, And it's just been a thrill to see these students grow in those areas.